Hi everybody, welcome back. This is the fourth video in the series of how to compose with a particular emphasis on GCSE and A-level music. And today we're going to be looking at chords and chord progressions using the circle of fifths and chord qualities and inversions and what chords like to follow on to other chords. So we'll get stuck straight into it. So let's have a wee look at the new handout. Okay, so we're looking at chords in the key of C major for this one. So you can see I've got all the chords of C major on the left hand side and some of the inversions that we're going to be using as well. And also you'll notice as well that above those chords I've written the Roman numeral analysis, which also takes into account the quality of the chords. So all of the major chords are capital Roman numerals and all of the minor chords are lowercase Roman numerals, and the diminished chord 7 is also a lowercase Roman numeral but with the little circle, the little diminished symbol right next to it. So yeah, just going to demonstrate some of those chords on the piano as well. So you can see there chord 1, of course, a major chord because we've got a major third and a perfect fifth. And of course, chord 2 then is actually a minor chord, the D minor chord. So we've got a minor third again between D and F this time. And D to A is still a perfect fifth. Another minor chord, chord 3, the E minor chord. E to G is a minor third. And E to B is our perfect fifth. And then back to major chords again with chord 4, our subdominant chord, I suppose. So F to A is a major third, and F to C is our perfect fifth. Chord 5, another major chord, our dominant chord, very important chord, of course, that we're going to be using quite a lot in our compositions. So G to B is a major third, and G to D is the perfect fifth. Major third, perfect fifth. And chord 6, the submediant chord, another minor chord, so A to C is our minor third. And A to E is our perfect fifth. And the chord that I suppose might trip some students up, this diminished chord. So we've got a minor third still between B and D, but a diminished fifth this time between B and F. Okay, so if you're a little unsure about intervals, I will have a video for that as well about how do we calculate intervals. It's very important that you know how intervals are calculated because that will allow you to understand chord qualities, especially if you're going to be using far more advanced chords than this, like suppose augmented sixth chords or diminished seventh chords, that type of thing. So being able to calculate your intervals is very important to be able to do that, to know what the quality of the chords are. You also can, of course, invert any of these chords. In other words, have a different bass note for each of the chords. But what I've done here in this handout is I've picked out, I suppose, some of the most popular ones, or at least the ones that will be used in our composition quite a bit. So we've got chord 1, 2, and 5 in first inversion. So what we've done with chord 1 there is instead of C, E, G, with C as our lowest note, we're going to put E as our lowest note. So it's first inversion with the E as our lowest note. It doesn't have to be exactly the notes I'm playing right now. It can be any notes, I suppose, as long as you're using the C, E, G with an E in the bottom somewhere. And the C's and the G's can, I suppose, be anywhere above that as well. So that's first inversion. That's still first inversion. That's still first inversion as well. So chord 1 first inversion, very, very popular. Chord 2 first inversion as well. So a DFA chord. That's it in root position with the root of the chord as our lowest note, but we're going to put F as our lowest note. You can even have it way down low on the piano here. And of course, chord 5, first inversion. So our GBD chord with the B as the lowest note. Okay. Any chord can be treated to first inversion. So we could have had chord 3 or chord 4 or chord 6 or even chord 7. Yes, of course, you can put those into first inversion as well. But just be careful about your movement, I suppose, and which notes you're going to be doubling in the chord. So there are certain rules or guidelines, I suppose, that we need to follow when we're doing all this to get nice, smooth voice leading and make sure we don't have any parallel octaves or anything or parallel fifths. And the other chords that we're going to be looking at, I've chosen 2 second inversion chords, but probably in reality, we're only going to be using chord 1 second inversion. So it's a 1C chord this time, C, E, G. But this time we're going to have the G as the lowest note. Okay, so that's our second inversion chord 1. Are probably most common, the most popular second inversion chord you'll ever come across. And chord 5 with a C this time for second inversion. Still a GBD chord, but with the D as our lowest note. Okay, so there are a few more restrictions when it comes to second inversion chords. You can't just use any chord in second inversion. They tend to be limited to chord 1, 4, and 5, your primary triads, your most stable chords in any key. But we're only going to be using 1C and maybe 5C, but we'll definitely be using 1C, especially at cadences. Coming up to the end of a phrase or the end of a section or the end of the piece. Okay. So that's all the harmony that you can see here. We can obviously transpose all of that into any key, any major key. And if you wanted to write something in a minor key, you will, of course, have to change the quality of all of those chords. So like C would be C minor, I suppose. If you wanted to compose a piece in the key of C minor, you would need an E flat in there. And that makes it, of course, a minor chord. So you have a minor third between C and E flat, and a perfect fifth between C and G. And our analysis of that would also change, so you'd have a lower Roman numeral, lowercase Roman numeral for that. And also all the other chords will obviously change their qualities too. So chord 2 would be diminished chord 2 because of the A flat in the key of C minor. Chord 3 would actually be a major chord most of the time. So E flats and B flats in the key of C minor. And chord 4 would actually become a minor chord because of the A flat. And chord 5 will still become a major chord. You tend to raise the 7th degree of the scale in a key of in a minor key. Chord 6 becomes a major chord because the A flat and the E flat again. Chord 7 stays as a diminished chord because again the raised 7th for that chord. So it's still got that diminished sound. And then chord 1 obviously goes back to being a minor chord. Okay, so yeah, be careful about what tonality you're going to start your piece in. Or are you going to start a major key or a minor key? I'm just going to show you guys in this lesson the major ones first. So that's great. What happens if you have all of that? What do you do with it? How do you use these chords? What progressions can you make from them, and where do chords like to move to? To answer that, we're going to jump into the circle of fifths, and probably one of the most famous diagrams you'll ever see for chord progressions. Okay, so I'm actually going to use my iPad to demonstrate some of these chord progressions, and I suppose the first one we should look at will be chord 1. It tends to be the most used chord, probably the most important chord in your composition. So we'll probably start with chord 1, and chord 1 can actually move anywhere. So we're actually going to have kind of a thick arrow coming out of chord 1, just to remind us that it can go anywhere to any of the other chords. Maybe not so much chord 3, but it can progress to chord 3, and depending on the style that you're going to be writing in. So chord 1 is our big chord. The chord that comes before chord 1 tends to be your dominant chord, chord 5. So if you think of your cadences, like your perfect cadences, chord 5 to 1 is very popular at the end of a phrase or at the end of your piece, but it can also happen in a lot of pre-cadential material, so just anywhere in your music, really. And if we remember that chord in the key of C major, at least, that chord is your GBD chord. It actually shares a couple of notes in common with chord 7, our diminished chord, so I'm just going to draw that chord next to chord 5. So chord 7 also likes to move to chord 1, and you actually do sometimes have that at cadences, like a leading note cadence as well. So you can see that if we use the notes from that chord, B, D, F, there are 2 notes that are in common with chord 5, the B and the D. And if we actually make this even a dominant 7th chord, we end up having an F in there as well, a G, B, D, F chord. That's your dominant 7th sound. And you can hear, hopefully, how if I play a full chord of that moving to chord 1, that it sounds nice and complete, nice and final. So even the sound of it sounds good. That's where it wanted to move to. So all of chord 7 is actually inside a dominant 7th chord. So those 2 chords are quite closely related, I suppose. The chord that comes before chord 5 tends to be your chord 2, but you can have others, of course, like another chord 1 or chord 4 or chord 6. But chord 2 to chord 5 is very good because it's 5 steps away. In fact, if I bring up the piano just to show you that, you could probably hear how chord 2 is 5 away from chord 5. And then 5, of course, is 5 away from chord 1. Yeah, so we're beginning our circle of fifths here, that we're moving by a fifth from one chord to the next chord. 2 moving to 5 is a fifth, 5 moving to 1 is a fifth, of course. Okay, there is another chord that belongs to this group as well. You could maybe have your chord 4 in there. And 4 can also move to chord 5, or it can move to chord 7, or it can even move to chord 2. So we can have movement down to chord 2, and we can have movement to chord 5 or to chord 7. So I'll just point him into the middle, I suppose. And the chord that comes before those 2 guys tends to be our chord 6. So 6 can move to 4, or it can actually move down to 2. And if it does move down to 2, then again we've got another circle of fifths. This would be our A minor chord, our ACE chord, and it's moving to our DFA chord, or chord 2. So if I was to play that on the piano, you can hopefully see how A, we go down 5, we end up in chord 2, and if we go down 5, we hit chord 5, and go down from that, we're obviously going to hit chord 1. So maybe something, a nice chord progression following your circle of fifths could be this. There we go. And chord 3 is the chord that would come before chord 6 as well. So 3 can move to 6. It's kind of a limited chord, and we also tend not to move to chord 3 that much from chord 1. So although chord 1 can move to any of these chords, so chord 1 could move to 6, 4, 2, 5, or 7, in classical and baroque music, you won't find it that often moving to chord 3. But I suppose it depends on the style that you're composing as well. Chord 4, of course, can jump across this and go straight to chord 1 to get your plagal cadence. So just like 5 to 1 is your perfect cadence, 4 to 1 would be your plagal cadence. But 5 can also move back to chord 6 for your interrupted cadence, or your deceptive cadence if you're using the American terminology. So you can see it's a bit of a spaghetti junction of arrows pointing everywhere, but I just wanted to show you how it's built up, and your circle of fifths are actually going to involve the chords that I'm circling here are all a fifth apart, and especially leaving out chord 3, I suppose, from 6 to chord 2 to chord 5 to chord 1. That's a very good chord progression if you can get that into your compositions. Okay, so we'll leave the iPad for the moment. Okay, so I've drawn a nicer version of this underneath these chords here. If we just scroll down the page a bit. Yeah. So what I've also done here is I've included the inversions. As you can see, where do we put all the inverted chords? So we're only going to be using, as I said, these inversions up here. So chord 1B likes to move to 4 or to 2. 1C nearly always, in fact, I would go so far as to say always, or it should move straight to chord 5. Chord 2B can actually move to 5 as well. And 5B nearly always, I would again go so far as to say, should move to chord 1, because you have that GBD chord with B in the bass, and it really wants to move up. It wants to resolve upwards, the leading note resolving up. So if I play just a chord progression that I've written down here is this one here, just to show you, I suppose, the movement in the bass line moving up like as a scale from one chord to the next chord, just to show you how you can move quite smoothly. Your bass line doesn't have to be jumping all the time. So we're going to move from 1 to 5C, 1B to 4, and then to 1C. Or we could skip chord 4 and move to 2B and move to 1C. We can do that if we like. 1C needs to go to 5. 5 then is going to go back to 6. And then 6 is going to go to 5B. And then 5B is going to go to 1. So if I just draw that in, I suppose, where we're starting and where we're going. So we're starting off with chord 1. That's our first chord. We're then moving to 5C, because chord 1 can move anywhere. So that is our second chord we're going to. Then we're going to follow this blue line around to chord 1B. That's our third chord. Then 1B, we are going to, we'll probably move up to 4. Yeah, we'll go to 4. Up to chord 4, because there's a couple of options there what we could do. Then 4 will move to 1C. Following this line, this blue line down here. Then 1C is going to move to chord 5, as it needs to, I suppose. That's our sixth chord. 5 is then going to move to 6, so we're going to follow this black line backwards to get us to chord 6. That's actually the seventh chord in this progression. And 6 is going to then move to 5B. So following this line backwards, or I suppose forwards this time, going to here to this 5B. That's going to be the 8th chord. And then, of course, 5B, we're going to go back to 1. That's going to be our final chord, or our 9th chord of this progression. So let's have a listen to this chord progression and see, can you follow along with me? So I'll just call it out the first time, I suppose. So chord 1. 5C, 1B, chord 4, 1C, chord 6, chord 5B, back to chord 1. So hopefully you're able to hear there how the chord is moving with the bass line going step as a scale. So. Okay, so it is a bit of a spaghetti junction, as you can see. You don't really have to memorize this as such. It's not as if any composer would sit with like a poster of this up in front of them and then think, right, I have to move to these particular chords. It's just a guide. If you get stuck thinking, where am I going to go? What's my harmony going to do after I'm on chord 4? Where does chord 4 like to move to? It doesn't have to. These are just standard chord progressions, very standard chord progressions to figure out where can I go with this. Okay, so it's just a guide. Okay, so underneath all of that, I've written a summary of those chords and where they like to move to. I haven't put in the inversions, but it is in the other handout just above. But you can see here that there is quite a lot of movement, but nearly all of it is wanting to go towards chord 1. So the dotted line I have coming out of chord 1, I always think of chord 1 as the queen on a chessboard. It can almost move anywhere. It's very powerful. It likes to go to any chord, maybe not so much chord 3 if you're going to be writing in a Baroque or classical style, but it can move anywhere. 5 and 7, as I say, they're so similar, especially if you make chord 5 a dominant 7th. They share so much in common that they actually form what we call the dominant function group. Their function, their purpose is to get to chord 1. Nearly all the time, if you use a chord 7, it will be like maybe flanked by chord 1s on either side of it, like a passing 6-3 progression. We'll deal with a lot of that later on when we start getting into the nitty-gritty of the composition. And also because it's a diminished chord, diminished chords like to be in first inversion quite a lot. So if you're going to use chord 7, in order to get rid of that sort of diminished fifth feel and the outer voices of that chord, if you put it into first inversion, you end up with a major 6th instead. So the tension is still there, but it's not as strong as it is there. Okay, so yeah, chord 7 can be used, but probably nowhere near as much as you're going to use chord 5. The chords that come before that, the predominant function group, I suppose, are 4 and 2. Chord 4 and chord 2 love to move to chord 5, especially chord 2. I've actually circled the circle of fifths. So 6 to 2 to 5 to 1 is a very, very strong chord progression and used quite a lot in music as well. As I say, 4 can skip the dominant function group and go straight to chord 1, and you end up with your plagal or the amen cadence, used a lot in choral music, because you have that, the tonic is in that chord, and it stays in that chord. That's where you have your amen. Sometimes those chords can be decorated and be quite romantic. Okay, so if you wanted to have chord 4, that's a very sort of calm, serene, static, and stable ending. Whereas perfect cadences do tend to have quite a bit of tension because you're introducing the leading note, which needs to resolve upwards to that tonic. But if you already have the tonic, there's not as much tension in that chord progression, in that cadence. Yeah, so 4 can be used as a cadence to get us straight to chord 1, or to chord 1 via a chord 5, and 2 to 5 is even nicer, I think. 6 can come before 4 and 2. It can also jump straight to chord 5. You also have that in your imperfect cadence if you wanted to end on your phrase on a chord 5. But it's very effective moving to your 4 or your 2. I use that quite a lot, especially when I'm modulating. I use chord 6 quite a bit. So I'll be showing you that in a later video, how to modulate, how to change key, and then have all of this material ready to go for another key. And as I say, chord 3 hardly used in classical and baroque, but that doesn't mean you can't use it. Of course you can. So chord 1 to 3, even in a lot of Debussy's music tends to move that way, through thirds. If you think of a lot of his music would do that. So you can move, say, 1 up to chord 3, and then 3 likes to move to chord 4. Again, be careful. I'm not paying attention to perfect fifths or octaves here. I'm just moving everything up. You don't want to do that in your compositions, of course. Have all those octaves and everything, unless you're writing something maybe more in a modern or pop style. If you're writing something in classical or especially baroque, that's a no-no. You can't have all those perfect fifths movements and perfect octave movements. But 3 moving to 4, I do think actually sounds quite nice. But if you actually listen to that chord, 2 of the notes in that chord, the E and the G, already belong to chord 1. The most powerful chord in the whole key, the whole chord progression. So we've already got 2 notes belonging to the more powerful chord, and the one that doesn't is that leading note, which wants to go up to 1 anyway. So chord 3 is actually quite weak. 3 to 4 sounds good, yes. But I think it could easily be substituted for a 1 first inversion, which I think sounds nicer, but it's down to personal taste, I suppose. Okay. Yeah, so that may be worth, I know I said you don't have to memorize it, but it's worth having it in the back of your mind, I think, or at least print it out and have it, in case you need to consult it for anywhere you get lost or you're thinking, where would the harmony like to go to? Underneath that, I've also got a version for minor keys, and notice that all the chord qualities except for 7 and 5 have changed. 7 and 5 are still a diminished and major chord. But everything else is changed. 1 is a minor chord, 2 is diminished, 4 is minor, chord 6 is a major chord, chord 3 is a major chord with the relative major, and even the subtonic chord can be used. I'll deal with that probably in another video explaining what the subtonic is, especially when we come to modulation, I think, if you want to modulate into the relative major key. So if we're in the key of C minor, that would be an E flat major chord there. So suppose if we tried doing that chord progression from before, but in a minor key this time. So there's a bit more tension in it, a bit more, it's a bit more serious, I think. Okay, so hopefully some of the chord progressions we looked at and the map, I suppose, the guidelines that you can see there, will help you figure out where do chords like to move to, where is the best place. Now, of course, you can come up with your own chord progressions, but if you ever get stuck, it's very handy to have this nearby. We will be looking at other things, of course, other more advanced chords like chromatic harmony and things, and modulation. If you want to change key, and if you're doing A level, I suppose you really should try to change key at least once somewhere in your piece. And even at GCSE, if you follow along with that video, you should be able to change key and then reuse these chord progressions in the new key. So it just makes life easier, I think, if you have a good idea of a harmonic structure or harmonic plan in your music, and just use that as a guide throughout your whole composition. It's probably going to be very important to at least have this sort of memorized or nearby when we come to the modulation, because I will be using these chord progressions quite a bit when we're modulating. So, yeah, again, if you have any questions or any comments, leave them below in the video and I'll try to get back to them, and I'll see you again next time.